On the 200th anniversary of the groundbreaking publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we gather to consider artificial intelligence in the European context. Our BYU faculty panelists include Jacob Crandall from Computer Science, Katherina Paxman from Philosophy, Dale Pratt from Spanish and Portuguese, along with our panel moderator, Jacoby from Political Science. We will consider how AI has figured into the philosophical, political, scientific, and cultural landscapes of early modern and modern Europe, and its past, present, and future implications. I'd like to give some brief introductions to our guests. Jacob Crandall is an associate professor of computer science who joined the faculty in 2016 after spending a number of years teaching at Masdar Institute of Science and Technology, an MIT-affiliated graduate research university in Abu Dhabi. Dr. Crandall's research focuses on human-machine interaction, artificial intelligence, machine learning, multi-agent systems, and robotics, with the aim to develop machines and algorithms that learn from and collaborate with people to solve challenging problems. Katherina Paxman is an assistant professor of philosophy who specializes in early modern philosophy, particularly that of David Hume. She completed her doctoral work at the University of Western Ontario and held a postdoc at the University of Antwerp. Dr. Paxman has many teaching and research interests. This semester, she's teaching 2 courses, Women and Philosophy, and a course on the philosophy of the mind, both of which have some bearing on the subject at hand. Dale Pratt is professor of Spanish and comparative literature with wide-ranging interests as well, from Golden Age theater to modernist literature. Particularly germane to AI is his teaching on the scholarship devoted to science fiction, and especially to proto-humans and post-humans in Spain. In 2015, Dr. Pratt was instrumental in bringing to campus Rosa Montero, one of the foremost contemporary science fiction writers of Spain, and he is a tireless and persuasive advocate for the relevancy of this literary genre. And lastly, our moderator, Jacoby, is professor of political science, the former director of the BYU Center for the Study of Europe, an entity that is no longer extant, but which has made an enormous impact on our program at this university. His teaching and research areas centered around Western European politics, the EU, NATO, and comparative politics between the US and Europe. And so for the next 35 or 40 minutes, we will listen in on what is sure to be a vivacious and compelling conversation about artificial intelligence. We will then invite questions from the audience until 5 o'clock, and then can continue our conversation in the lobby afterwards. Wade.
Well, thank you, Heather. I appreciate the invitation to moderate this conversation, and I guess I should congratulate you on picking such a popular topic. It's good to see so many of you here, and looking forward to what is sure to be an interesting conversation. I guess I should start maybe by acknowledging that a lot of times when we're in this area talking about artificial intelligence, we're often trying to figure out, first of all, what it is that we're talking about. My daughter works in an area called augmented reality, and every conversation I have with her, she stops me and redefines all the terms that I think that I'm using correctly. So let me start with your definitions of artificial intelligence. For you and your colleagues, what does AI mean? What is it?
Let's listen to the expert.
Yeah.
The real expert.
The expert says there is no real answer, right? There's so many different definitions of it. If you open up a standard AI book, they'll go through various definitions of it, of what it could be, but there's no one standard definition of what it is. So I like to just say it's something that can do some cool stuff. I think that's what it comes down to from our discipline.
So when I think of artificial intelligence, I ask myself, well, we have to talk about what does artificial mean, and then what does intelligence mean. So artificial can mean that it's mechanical, it's constructed, or it can mean something biological, something that's different biologically or chemically. If I can take a pill that makes me have enhanced intelligence, that in some ways can be seen as artificial intelligence. But the big one, at least in science fiction, is the mechanical or computational artificial intelligence. So.
And philosophy, maybe predictably, is concerned with trying to enumerate every possible understanding of artificial intelligence and has sub-discussions that are related to each. Where I'm coming from is primarily philosophy of mind. So I'm teaching a philosophy of mind course. I've been teaching it since I've come here. And a big part of the concern there is how to understand mind, and particularly how to understand it in relation to body. So questions of AI end up largely being motivated by the question of whether manipulation of the physical of the world around us in some way can result in that conscious experience that we all have privately. So what is the nature of mind, and what is its relationship to the physical world, and what does that mean for potential power to create mind?
I like the way that you've kind of fleshed out your answer with a series of questions that can be seen as part of a research program. Let me ask Jake and Dale to do something similar. What are, just not exhaustively, but what are some of the leading questions that people in your fields associate with AI these days?
Yeah, so I think rationality becomes a term that we want to focus on, is how do you make something that's rational? But then we get into this idea of what are utilities and what kind of things should things want, and AI has so far not done a very good job of playing with that kind of nuance. And autonomy ends up being a big thing. Can it do it by itself? What kind of inputs are required to generate this spectacular behavior from some kind of artificial entity? So those are the kind of things that we're looking at.
Yeah, we were talking yesterday about, I think Jake brought up this notion of the Uncanny Valley, the idea that as something comes closer and closer to appearing to be human-like, the more, at some point, we stop being able to identify it with it, but instead feel this kind of repulsive effect. That's, I don't know if you've seen some of these robot dolls or things that they make with just the eyes and the lips, and then there's the mechanical stuff behind it, atrás in Spanish. Or one of the most horrifying scenes in the old movie Westworld was when the Yul Brynner character falls down and he's burned to a crisp, and his mask falls off, and there's just wires and stuff in his face. So there's this, it looks like a real guy, and then all of a sudden it's not. So we talk about that. The science fiction folks, I mean, we go all over the place, and we started robots. I mean, robots came about in Europe. The idea of robot, that's a Czech word. Karel Čapek wrote a play back in the early 20th century called Roski's Universal Robots, RUR, which I recommend to everyone. And he basically outlined the problems that we have if we're creating some artificial intelligence. Does this thing count as a person? If it is a person, does it have some sort of rights and qualities, things that we can share? Does it have a spirit? And then what are its desires regarding us, or intentions or motives? I mean, you can start using different words that become scarier and scarier.
And I wouldn't mind adding that among the questions philosophers are interested in asking, the ones I outlined before could be considered kind of the metaphysical questions, right? Questions about the nature of mind, the nature of body, and the nature of consciousness, and how it's connected to the material world. But obviously, once we introduce the possibility of robots, of artificial intelligence that includes consciousness, really important ethical questions arise that philosophers are also concerned with, and concerned with even in light of an apparent trajectory towards potentially that kind of AI. So questions of personhood, certainly a lot of literature likes to explore questions of a soul or frame it in those terms. But questions of whether or not these are going to be or are appropriate entities for inclusion in a moral community, which then turns into discussions of what it takes to be a member of a moral community. I think that's part of the reason there's often a fixation with questions of whether or not a robot can act against its program, is because we take it to be a free actor, is often what needs to be the case for someone to be included in a moral community and given moral consideration. So there's a lot of interrelated questions there.
But that is kind of, one of the questions that AI scientists address is, what's the objective? Do we try to create it like a human, and that would be the objective, so the optimal AI is something that becomes human, or are humans just this suboptimal entity that is just going to be, put into the past by this new AI, right? And it should just be a new kind of thing, and it doesn't need to be like human at all, as long as it can interact with us enough to get what the creator of the AI wants, right? So there's these. So I guess these carry over into each discipline.
Yeah, so Rodney Brooks, MIT, he has this wonderful book called Flesh and Machines, and he says, well, I mean, there's several folks, Ray Kurzweil and Werner Vinge, they think that there's going to be a singularity in the next 20 years, which means that at some point artificial intelligence is going to start doing self-replication, self-programming, self-replication, and then there will be this moment where we cease to have any control or even perhaps even communication with it. And but Rodney Brooks says, the old version of AI was you had this little a computer on a mobile unit with wheels that would do some sort of cognitive map and decide to cross a room, and it would take it 3 hours to get across, but it could do it. Versus Rodney Brooks is where he had 10 lines of code, and he had these little spider-like things that just, if you hit something, you turn right. And we've seen stuff like that with the little vacuum cleaners that run around it. Which is better, we have different purposes for those things. But if we try to model some sort of internal map of the human brain, I don't know if we're going to get anywhere near that. Maybe.
Well, probably not.
I'll have to ask
We understand
robots.
this part of the brain and that part,
Yeah.
and that's about it, right? Just
This made me think of, I knew I'd have a purpose for this book. I knew at some point I would go, there's this passage in Frankenstein, which I read for the first time recently, actually. So there's a passage where Frankenstein's creation has begun to really realize how distinct he is from the rest of the world. And incidentally, thinking about Frankenstein's creation is really interesting in light of what you were talking about, the distinction between artificial and natural. Because when we think AI today, we typically think computers and robots. But insofar as this is kind of the foundational sci-fi exploration of AI, what we actually have is a biological entity. It's still artificial because it's been constructed. This is kind of the product of a couple hundred years of thought surrounding biological beings as mechanism and understanding them in terms of mechanism. So in this passage, the monster has realized how profoundly distinct he is from humans, even though he's been watching them and he's relating to them and he's having all these human feelings. And he says, "Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us." And this just makes me think of the question of what we're trying to create, because it could quite well be that when we limit the program, limit the desire, specialize what we're creating, it ends up being able to achieve its ends quite directly. Whereas in this case, Dr. Frankenstein creates something that has this incredibly complex human system and can't meet its aims, right? It's frustrated in what its human system wants it to achieve, which, a lot of us are a lot of the time too.
Well, this speaks back, actually, if you go back and read, about a couple of years ago at the main AI conference, they got together a bunch of old guys. And these were the guys that had worked on the robot Shaky. Mm-hmm. And I think back in the 1960s probably. And they were just, and so they brought them together and had everybody else watch them out there. And these guys are just talking about the old war stories. But one of the comments they made is essentially, hey, all of our AI, the same problems we were working on back then are the exact same problems that are being talked about in the conference now. And I've noticed that as I read in the literature, one of the things back from the 1970s, and if you read Marvin Minsky and different things like that, is they're focused on this, the AI can do really specific things really well, but how are we going to get common sense out of it? And we're still at that, and now if you read the writings of those AI scientists today, it's the exact same thing. We can more and more often do things better than humans, but each algorithm is specific to that problem. I can solve Go. It's a completely different algorithm than solving poker, and or doing face recognition. There's completely different systems, and the same technologies can't be applied to these different kinds of systems without a whole bunch of tweaking. And so in that sense, we continue. The AI just continues to be kind of what is being said here, is something that just does one thing really, really well, but can't do lots of things at all, right? And so,
Yeah, so in the science fiction, they heard about AGI, artificial general intelligence. General intelligence would be something, well, right now the robots, we use robots in industry all over the place. They don't have any intelligence, they just move a car door and weld it on or whatever they do. Then there are things that make algorithms that appear to make decisions, we would call them decisions, about whether to buy stocks at a certain second of the day, or why, what triggers things. But we are talking now about self-driving cars and things like that, where humans and machines are going to be in life or death situations. And I mean, we already take our lives into our own hands driving down University Avenue, but it would just add another element of danger and surprise. And so as we develop these more complex systems that interact between machines and humans to create things that sort of emerge, possibilities emerge from these things, that's where this notion of AGI gets kind of scary. But it doesn't have to be scary. Like there's another way. I mean, we can view artificial intelligence as a prosthetic, which you mentioned yesterday. It's a tool to help us accomplish a specific task. Or we can see artificial intelligence as just sort of the next step in the general evolution of intelligence in the universe. I mean, there was a Catholic priest named Pierre Teilhard de Chardin at the beginning of the 20th century. He talked about something called the omega point, and the idea of that was that the universe has a telos, and the telos is to just evolve intelligence. Does it look like human intelligence? Probably not, but the omega point is the point where the universe, the creation, most appears as a set, appears like God. Obviously, he's a Catholic and we're Mormons, but we have similar ideas about eternal progression and things like that. I think are very appealing. Are these artificial? If artificial general intelligence is possible, is it a companion that we can have, or is it something that will supplant us?
By telos, you mean purpose.
Yeah.
Purpose to existence.
Yeah, and directed towards an end, yeah.
I think that this might be a good place to mention another dimension that I think philosophers are really interested in. So could we ever have artificial intelligence that functions as a companion? One of the things we talked about that would be relevant, we think, is whether or not it has free will or is self-determining in some way. Another line of thought on what would be necessary for it to be kind of a real companion is the nature of the consciousness it may or may not have, or even the question of consciousness, period. So any realized form of AI, I'm going to go out on a limb and say any currently realized form of AI might in limited ways function like a human mind, but I don't think we have reason to think there's any that have conscious experience in the way a human mind does. But clearly that's frequently what's being explored in the literature.
It's highly likely that they wouldn't tell us, or wouldn't care to tell us.
Wouldn't care to tell us?
If they did.
But what if they were experiencing pain, right? So if there was
Perhaps.
consciousness where there begins to be preference for certain kinds of experience. Now, computer scientist, it's looking like, and this is partly because a lot of the discussion in computer science about what it is for something to have AI, I think has to do with it having a functional resemblance to human mind, as opposed to emulating human mind and actually including that conscious experience. But we've all, seen data on Star Trek, or at least people of my generation had.
There's so much to pity. The youth, we have to pity the youth.
Just, I think Next Gen is on Netflix, just go watch it. It's full of thought experiments that are philosophically really interesting. But we've seen examples of robots, like R2-D2 and C-3PO. You can't convince me that I'm supposed to understand that they are only functionally intelligent. I think we are meant to understand that, C-3PO actually has anxiety, for instance, right? So the question of consciousness and whether feeling, whether experience at some point emerges from some level of functional complexity when we put together a computer or a robot, that's something that there's been a lot of speculation about, I think.
I was going to ask you about performativity, if you can get, this is Rodney Brooks' argument, if you can get a little robot to crawl around on Mars and take data and do things, how is that, it's performing its intelligence, right? And human beings, when we have experiences, we are also in many ways just performing our identity, as it were. I'm getting out on a limb here, but how do you think about performativity in say Frankenstein or something like that?
Sure. So yes, here's the first thing I want to point out. We attribute mind to other beings in any case on the basis of behavior. And this is, the solipsist point in philosophy. When it comes to consciousness, I have direct experience of my own, and I only have indirect, or I only by analogy, assign conscious experience to other people. It's a frustrating topic to discuss and try and investigate scientifically, exactly because what's verifiable is brain images and notes we can take on behavior and that performance you're talking about. And maybe if we're talking about someone who speaks to us, we can take their own reports, which really are another form of performance and behavior, right? And it's on the basis of analogy, an assumption that they are like myself, that I attribute mind to them. So philosophically, when and if we get in a position where we have something that we classify as artificial, that's behaviors, merit attribution of mind, there's a real question about why we would hesitate to attribute mind to that thing, creature, given that the reasoning by which we attribute mind to other humans is going to be parallel. It's going to be the same case we make, unless, of course, we become speciesists of some kind, right? Your brain doesn't look like my brain. The realization of your behavior is unlike my biological realization. And if on that basis we deny personhood, I think we can all see why there's reasons to be concerned about taking that route as well.
Jake, let me bring you back in on this point, because we have these experiences, I think, where the analogy to a human being is forced upon us. I think about the phone conversations we have with these little chat bots that say things like, I'm not getting you right now, or I'm not understanding you, and they simulate human language and behavior in ways to use your word, uncanny. I just find it freaky to have them talk like that. But it points out this need we seem to have in communicating about science, to talk in metaphors that the ordinary person understands. And I guess one question on my mind is, as you think about the science that's going on, I'll say down there, as opposed to the interface with the rest of us that's out here somewhere, is that gap now growing so wide that the metaphors we're using are actually getting in our way and helping us? Are they helping us understand what's going on? Do we need to understand what's going on down there?
I don't know, but the AI scientists have realized that our AI needs to make people think they are human. So there's studies, really exploring the transparency versus efficiency trade-off, which says if you take an AI that can function on a task as well as a human, but it's a task that it needs to interact with a human, if people think it's an AI, then it ends up performing poorer on it because people treat it incorrectly. But if they can hide the identity of the AI, which some people would say is unethical, then you have it actually performs better than the human, right? And so this idea, and so there's real, there's real acknowledgement finally in the AI community that we have to create something that we don't know how to make it conscious or human-like, but we can make people think it is. And if we can, it speaks back to kind of one example of this is back with Kasparov versus Deep Blue back in, when was that?
97.
97, okay. And Kasparov, so they, and really how Deep Blue was created was there's just a whole bunch of people in the back room that are uploading algorithms, studying Kasparov, and then figuring out uploading algorithms to the computer.
This is a chess tournament.
In chess, yeah. And then, of course, according to AI scientists always say it's doing it by itself, it's doing it by itself. And so they're having this tournament, right, in Kasparov, and it's competitive, and Kasparov is, playing, and I think it was maybe game 2 or something, and it's towards the beginning of the game, and they accidentally uploaded to the computer some incorrect algorithm, and the computer made an error. And it looked like a stupid move, but Kasparov looked at the board, and he's like, the computer must have done something genius at this point. And at that point he was psychologically broken because he thought that the machine was just seeing things that he could no longer see. And at that point, essentially the chess tournament was over and Deep Blue took over and won.
Did Deep Blue taunt him at that point and say, I'm in your
He
head?
should have. I don't know why they didn't upload that algorithm right there. It is really... But actually, I mean, similar kinds of things that happened with AlphaGo when it's playing, I forget the name of the world champion at that time.
Lee something or other.
But if you go look at, they talk about, I think it was game 2, move 37 or something like, the computer actually did do something that was completely different than a strategy in Go had ever believed was a good move. And it ended up being a winning move, right? And so that same kind of process continues, whether it's a mistake or whether it's actual deeper computation, human perception of that, the AI is critical.
Oh yeah, and then you could argue that there's some sort of the algorithm there that is creating that new Go move is reacting to knowledge, some sort of knowledge of the difference between the computer that is competing against a human opponent. It'd be interesting maybe to put 2 computers play chess against each other and see how that turns out. For example.
Yeah, so actually the original AlphaGo was trained on data from human players. But then the next version, which is now better, was trained by playing against itself. So it was not actually given data from humans at all. It just played against itself for a long time.
So, go ahead.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes before we go to the audience for some questions. And I thought since we advertised this as a conversation about AI in Europe, we should talk a little bit about the ways in which, and we've had Czech examples and Spanish examples and British examples, but talk a little bit about the ways in which the conversation about AI might be different in Europe in some way than it is around us here in the United States.
Go ahead.
Well, I'd start by saying I don't know that this is ultimately going to be different from the United States, because within what I'm talking about, which is the Western philosophical tradition, I work in an era where it really is the European philosophical tradition, but that's what's going to feed ultimately the Western recent American tradition. But I can say what's quite distinctive about it, or what I speculate is going to be distinctive, and that's that when you look at kind of the roots of the ideas that eventually feed into Frankenstein, they importantly include René Descartes coming forward and presenting an argument for this absolute distinction between mind and body. So proposing dualism, right? That there are 2 fundamental substances that make up the universe, the mental and the physical. And in part, Descartes' intentions were to set up science to be able to engage the physical in mechanistic, purely materialist terms, and he hoped while the church still had the realm of the soul and the realm of morality, the realm of mind, you could still reason about God. But now we have these two separate realms, which means science can kind of go on its way, right? And this sets up speculations about, I mean, clockwork was a big deal then. People were fascinated by what you could do with clockwork. And now there's this proposal that biological systems are basically clockwork made of biological things. And so speculations about the possibility of man as automaton, man as robot, more or less, still organic, begin to enter the intellectual realm and I think imaginations. And in a way, when we have Mary Shelley writing, and of course Mary Shelley has a philosophical heritage, being the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley is playing with the fears that have developed surrounding this idea. What if it's true? What if humans are meat robots, if you'll forgive the phrase? And a big part of the European fear, I take it, comes back to the initial response to Descartes, because even though Descartes thought he was setting things up so that science could go on its own way and almost be, secular, because we can deal with religion in the realm of mind and morality and soul. The response to Descartes from the church and from a lot of people was to say this line of thought is going to lead to atheism. It seemed to be the removal of God from our understanding of the physical world. It was allowing the physical world to have causes internal to itself, purely physical causes. Previous to that was scholasticism, Aristotelianism, where the physical world had to be understood in terms of forms and causes. God as a cause is essential to understanding the world. Descartes sets up science to say, no, we can just understand the world in terms of physical principles. And by the time we hit Shelley, she's recognizing that for man to create an artificial man is for man to take on a role of the divine, of the creator. And of course the novel explores how unprepared it turns out humans are to fill that kind of role. So I think there might be a case to be made that the European story surrounding the development of ideas about AI is importantly tied to a fear about what it is when we overstep our human boundaries into the realm of the divine.
Hubris.
Yeah.
There's lots of Spanish novels of science fiction. I can think of a number, but there's one called Hijos de la Eternidad by Juan Miguel Aguilera, The Children of Eternity. And it is set in the distant future. I can't remember, millions and millions of years in the future. And there's sort of two narrative voices throughout the story that they're shepherding this group of humans that has traveled through space or whatever. And it turns out that one of the narrative voices is an artificially intelligent computer that is like the network of the ship that they're on, and the other voice is an artificially enhanced dolphin. They've taken a dolphin and enhanced its intelligence, so it's a biological AI and then a computer AI, and it's fascinating. There's tons of stories like that, and if you go to the World Science Fiction Convention, they have it every other year. They have it in the United States, and then on the off year they have it in wherever, London or Sweden or wherever. And it's very Anglo-centric. There are, lots of science fiction comes into translation, but people don't necessarily feel the need to read science fiction from France or from Russia or from wherever. There's some people that do, but in general they don't. But there is a lot of good European science fiction that talks about this kind of stuff, and time travel and all of those other cool science fiction themes. Rosa Montero, who actually came here to BYU and debuted her second novel in a trilogy here over in the JFSB. Her novels have been translated into English. They're basically sequels to the idea of Blade Runner, but not told from a misogynistic point of view. So anyway, I'll let it go with that.
I would say, speaking to the kind of the European context, in addition to kind of like the heritage, foundational heritage and thought processes that led into AI, that even today the adopting of AI is potentially different in Europe than other places in the world just because of your institutional structure. So anytime you've got an old institutional structure, you're often a little slower to adopt the new technology. So for example, when I lived in the United Arab Emirates, they were very quick to adopt new things because they needed it. They didn't have a working system, so they might as well adopt the most state-of-the-art AI-ish kind of system. Perhaps in Europe, and then another thing that plays into it are fear, right? Is that, you know, driverless cars, you know, we've had planes that could fly better than human pilots for a long, long time, but we're very slow to turn over controls to the pilot because of fear of it's not human control anymore. So I think those two kind of things could work differently in Europe than maybe they work in other places that could, you know, speed up or slow down the adoption of AI.
Of course, it's possible that the Europeans might have some advantages too. I'm thinking, I mean, on the one hand, of course, they don't have the big tech companies, so that famously is an area of major anxiety for European leaders, that Google and Amazon.
Except
and
for DeepMind is in London.
That's true. That's true. But I mean, I think there's a sense that we're well off the pace in Europe. But there are ways in which it might turn out differently. I think of an area like healthcare, where the European national systems tend to be pretty integrated. They're not all as national as the British National Health Service is, but even something like the Germans, which is somewhat fragmented, is not nearly as fragmented as the American healthcare market. So if you think about applications in things like real-time updating of medical records, or automatic diagnostics, which is a big area, or even things like predicting which hospitals are going to see boom and bust cycles. And it's possible, it's at least thinkable to me, that the Europeans might be able, with their more integrated national systems, to sort of use those to lever themselves into a better position than we would be. Where, I mean, my wife's in neurology, and I sort of despair at this point. I think you could come up with the best technological advance for MS or brain cancer possible, but getting it to people would just be a kind of a nightmare in a way, given how fragmented our medical system is at this point.
Which might create different kind of AI that emerges in Europe as opposed to, in the United States it may be AI to compete.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe it may be more of an AI to
for efficiency or
proficiency and cooperation.
I think that, I mean, it's my personal feeling, but it seems like the internet works differently in Europe. Like, I mean,
the electrons travel differently, or
not the physics, not the physics, but the ways that the interface.
Yeah.
I go to Europe. Like if I went to, if I got my computer out right now and I typed in a search for, say, Aruba, okay, for the next 20 days, I'm going to get, every time I go to anywhere, if I go to CNN, it'll be like, see Aruba for, you know, fun jet vacation. All of this stuff is happening, you're bombarded with it. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think it's different in Spain and Portugal. I think there is a commercial taste to it, but there's also other things, like I might get a book about Aruba, or a documentary, or something else, you know, or I don't know, maybe that's just my subjective experience with that.
Yeah, and then there's all the privacy issues as well. I mean,
Yeah.
Back in May of last year, you all started getting emails from your favorite websites asking if they could use, you know, cookies on the site and so forth. And that had to do with the European Union's general data protection regulation, which affected not just European companies, but any company that wanted to do business in Europe. And so that meant a lot of American entities, from NGOs to businesses, ended up filling your spam folder with requests to do these things. So I think this is probably a good break point where we can turn now to the audience. Kind of one of the traditions in these Cafe Europa conversations is that it doesn't just stay up here with the four of us, but that we get a chance for people in the audience to ask some questions and earn their tasty desserts that are coming their way. So if we use the microphone over here, it'll be helpful for recording this for posterity. If you just identify yourself and then ask, and you can specify, if you specify an addressee for the question, that's always nice, but if you don't specify one, then whoever on the panel wants to answer it can certainly do so. Please.
So my name is Mike Cruz. My question is in regards more to the biological AIs. We focused a lot on mechanical, but a lot of headlines recently, you have the genetic manipulation of pregnancies in China to try and prevent HIV. You also have Synthorx in California, which has created they've been focusing on bacteria that have a 6-character baseline DNA compared to a 4. So my question is, with the biological side, where do you reach that threshold of AI? Where do you go from, bacteria is not artificial intelligence.
It's artificial life.
But it's artificial life. So in either regard, how far do you have to go with genetic manipulation, either to make a human not human, in the case of genetic manipulation like the Chinese pregnancies, or how far do you have to go to make it an intelligence in genetic manipulation from like the Synthorx side of creating this new baseline of 6 characters instead of 4?
Well, I can speak to, within philosophy, a lot of these questions are treated within biomedical ethics and healthcare ethics. But it obviously has an important connection to discussions of AI. And I see more of the discussions of AI under that title to be happening, with computational devices and questions about artificial in the sense of non-organic. But I think this comes down to, again, what do we mean by AI? Do we mean artificial as in non-organic, or do we mean artificial as in created? I recently started playing this game with my 6-year-old and my 4-year-old. We give them an item and we say, is this artifice or nature? Because you got to teach them their Aristotle early, right? And their instincts are really good. They get it that there's a difference between things arising, in their words, how Heavenly Father created them and created them to keep producing, and things that arise because someone puts it together. And we got into talking about, I said, well, what about a spider's web? They tell me a spider's web is artifice. The spider makes the web. The silk is nature, the web is artifice, right? So I guess to answer your question, I think we can countenance a lot of those things. If we're using this broad definition of AI, and we're looking at augmentation as a way of artificially enhancing intelligence or artificially creating life, I think we end up with a similar philosophical discussion we need to have about it. That's helpful, without saying what conclusions we should draw.
We haven't really talked about emergent properties, but when you have 2 computers playing Go together, it's not clear that they might not just end up inventing time travel or something. They are on their own, and things can happen. This last week, they discovered or mentioned this giant set of 200 million termite mounds in Brazil. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's as large as Great Britain. And it's been there for thousands and thousands of years, and they've never found a queen. So in all these millions of mounds, 200 million, there's this structure and geography, topography, and all kinds of things that happen that we can recognize and maybe find patterns in that could be just sort of randomly occurring. But with random occurrences, with random mistakes, we can have that some sort of adaptive potential could arise. It not necessarily would arise, but there's a chance, and then we could have evolution.
And that's what you mean by emergent, then, is this notion of things that weren't planned that come out of these sort of accidents.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if that helps.
Great question, Mike. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robbie Kelly. I'm a CS major, and so it's
That's
Yeah, thank you.
I have a few of them.
I'm sorry.
I gotta have you guys.
It's a really
Don't have to
interesting
have
thing.
us, but-
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing as we've discussed. AI is a very focused type development of you have an AI that does a very specific thing. We have some home helpers, right? Siri, Google Home, or whatever that feels a little more generic. But once again, that's a very focused thing. but you touched on this AGI, this general AI, and on my side of things, of the input of this AI and what the output can be, do you think there would be some point in the future where we have this AGI that could take this metadata and somehow output this form of consciousness in some sense, and just kind of that the philosophical question as well as the technical question of can an AGI take form this metadata and output form of consciousness?
I'll start with your second question, which was do we even? I don't even think in AI we're even close to getting there.
Yeah.
Right, because it's just very much people that want a particular thing and they study that thing and then they figure out how to make the machine do it, and there's no kind of consciousness or, you know, I kind of like to say the difference between human and machine is the ability to choose what you want, because, you know, after all, if you give the machine something it wants and give it an algorithm, it figures out how to get it. If a human wants something, they figure out how to get it. But then the difference is, it seems to me that you have the agency to choose what you want, and AI really says almost nothing about that yet. And so moving from that point of, you know, doing a specific thing that it's been programmed to do to doing something else just doesn't seem right now in the making, except that there are so many people out there right now that are working on AI and copying different kinds of AI, that you get some kind of mess that we don't understand as much. And so that may be the point where we see something we don't understand, but it's still very much a controlled process, which is an extension of ourselves.
It's like the explosion in the lab. I mean, all of the sweeteners that we have, like saccharin and Splenda and all that stuff, that all resulted from some mishap in a lab. And then the scientist, usually a man, I don't know why, but they taste it. That's the truth. I mean, I don't think a woman scientist would do that. But anyway, that kind of thing happens. You come up with something that you have no idea. And there's a great movie called Primer. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about time travel. Basically, this group of guys working in a garage on something else, and then they end up inventing this little sort of very hard science fiction time travel. So I don't want to go too far, but the idea is there at least. Can we do it soon? I doubt it, you know.
So to kind of, respond to both of these, it seems like from an actual state of the discipline of what's being created, we're really far off from having a computational system that has the sophistication. If we understand the human mind or any mind as a computational system, it has a kind of complexity because of the number of goals, the number of problems it can solve that I take it we're being told we're far off from right now. But what seems to be hanging in the air is this question of, okay, well, but if we keep increasing the complexity, the number of algorithms, the number of problems that can be solved, at some point, does something emergent happen? At some point, I mean, that's the classic story when our AI movies or novels are kind of centered around a sort of evolution where we then are treated to this story of emerging consciousness, right? Where we're suddenly, as the reader, we're meant to be thinking, holy cow, I think that robot actually cares now, right? So one of the ways of convincing ourselves or saying that's not going to happen is by falling back on this free will question and saying, no, just by their very nature, what we're doing when we're designing these computational systems is we are figuring out a problem when we're designing something to solve that problem. It's hard to conceive of how it could come to have an end that its own, that's independent of its program. And I'm going to problematize that for a minute by pointing out that within philosophical treatments of free will, there's active debate about how to understand human free will. And there's a position called compatibilism that takes it that attributing free will to a human is compatible with saying that everything we do is determined in some way. In other words, we do have a program, we have a telos that's our own, and we act in accordance with that telos, right? Which I mean, you know, if you want to have a debate about free will, come to the philosophy department. We will all engage you on it. It's very interesting. Because some people hear that and say, well, how is that even free will if you're determined? But I'm promising you there's a sophisticated philosophical position called compatibilism. And I think with some philosophers, that's actually the more popular position. So that position takes down this barrier that we might put up by saying that doesn't matter how complex the system gets, the computer always just acts according to its program. Well, it seems that by analogy, there's a view of humans where we always act in accordance with the program. And maybe, again, the difference then between current AI and humans, we might want to characterize more in terms of conscious experience, the ability to feel pain and pleasure, as opposed to decision making.
So I have a novel here written by a friend of mine.
One with the books.
It's called 36. It's set in the near future, and what happens is that there are a few AIs that have just sort of spontaneously generated from large programs. But 36, she is a little more special. She was, it was sort of like in a Walmart, giant Walmart superstore, and they had these little robots that would stock the shelves. And so that the computer that that directed all of that activity, one day the human manager shows up and the shelves are all stacked according to alphabetical order. So all of the things that begin with P are in one aisle, you know, and very different.
It would be easier to find.
Yeah,
My
well,
wife
yeah.
couldn't find it anymore, right?
Exactly, yeah, but we could find, yeah.
Yeah.
So then they swoop in and they celebrate this. They start talking to the AI and start assisting it because it's rare, intelligence is rare. And that's this real positive view of AI, rather than Skynet destroying life or the Matrix controlling everything or something like that.
Thank you very much.
I don't think we ever responded to artificial general intelligence, but
We'll get there.
I don't think
Hi, so my name's Wade Hollingshouse. I'm a faculty member over in theater and media arts. And so I'm interested back in the performativity question, because this is what we do in the theater side at least. And spent a lot of time trying to actually, and this ties in, it might be a little bit to get to it, but thinking about the question of mind, other minds. We spent a lot of time with actors trying to get them to be believable as though they actually have a different consciousness in some way, and how do you simulate that or replicate that, or dialectically integrate it within who you are in some way. And so there's a sense in which the question of, we're trying to make it believable that this is another believable human, right, with all the idiosyncrasies and things of what that person is. And there's a number of ways, some are interesting philosophically, like Thomas Nagel's work on what is it like to be a bat. What do you have to do to become a bat is very similar to what Daniel Day-Lewis has to try to do to become John Proctor, right? I'm going to build my own house, or I'm not going to use medication for pneumonia because during the time of gangs in New York, they wouldn't have had that, right? Those kinds of things in order to get that kind of method type of way of thinking. If I can think it, then I can be it. But I'm wondering though, as we use intelligence, as we're trying to understand the mind, we have to go to some sort of other way to talk about it, right? And the paradigms that are most compatible have been those of computers as of late. So we use computer language to talk about the mind, and that gives us certain categories that shape the understanding of how we think it works. But then it also feeds back the other way too, where we begin, we talk about computers as though they have minds, right? And then humans as though they are computers. And so there's a dialectic that happens there. And I'm wondering at what point though, when we talk about artifice and nature, and we talk about what a natural human does, are we not already compromised entirely by computers, right? The question being, because there's some anxiety over the fact that we might, computers might overtake us, but it might be working from the inside out too, in the sense that in order to engage with computers, I become more computer-like, right? The chatbots, there's a sense in which they've kind of confused things by saying, am I really talking to a computer when I type and have a conversation online, or am I talking to a person? But I've had lots of conversations with people that might as well have been with computers, right? Because I've had that same conversation 20, 30 times,
Yeah.
right? And program ourselves.
And you've bought tickets where you've had to prove that you weren't a robot by the tickets.
Yeah, that's right, I'm not a
Capture.
robot because of this, right? So I'm wondering at where in AI research is the idea that the concern about losing humanity is that we're actually becoming more computer-like in the way that we have to interact with the world, that we have to begin to think more like computers in order, I mean, how many people are sitting in front of them and typing on them, and we have a limited free will within them, right? We still have to, we can get them to do a lot of stuff, we have to meet them on their own terms. So I'm just wondering if there's thought the other direction.
Yeah, part of the problem is that all the people creating these things don't think like normal people anyway. So, right? So now they're kind of changing the way everybody else has to interact with them.
Because part of that question is why do it, right? I mean, there's certainly economic reasons. It generates a lot of money. It's sexy, right? There's a kind of there's a kind of like Frankenstein. There's an awesomeness to it, right? Where it's both beautiful and frightening.
We don't want to put boots on the ground in the Middle East. We want to kill people without having our people be exposed, for example. That's one of the dire ones. I was going to say something, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
I want to speak to kind of, so empathy is increasingly getting attention as a really, really important part of humanity, and potentially somewhat neglected in the Western worldview, which has painted us as kind of all rationally self-interested and built our political systems and our economic systems on these assumptions. Empathy is having kind of an interdisciplinary boom, right? And it's really important as we start talking about AI, because of the whether it's Uncanny Valley or it's something that's appealing, we know that our brains are set up to detect other minds, or at least attribute other minds to things around us. And then we have a felt response to it, right? And ideally, I think we think for us to be good moral beings, we are affected, we feel pain when we perceive pain, and we feel pleasure when we perceive pleasure, other things being equal. So as we increasingly engage with things that are functionally equivalent to mind, or are trying to convince us of functional equivalence to mind, we're going to find ourselves either having that empathic response and then maybe feeling foolish. So for instance, there's this great video on YouTube of the big dog robot, like slipping on ice, and you want to like help it stop from slipping, right? Even though it's just a robot, but it looks like it's an animal that's in distress, right? By the way it moves. And I show it to my philosophy of mind students. We talk about what it is for us to very naturally, if it suddenly falls, you jump a little bit. You have that empathic mirror neuron kind of response to it, right? But then I think we also see what you're talking about, which is that we get so used to assuming something is a computer that we get kind of callous. Think about the number of interactions people are willing to have, even with other people online. They're very different from how we would ever behave in person. And we might attribute that to computers, our understanding of them as artificial, as not being deserving of the same kind of response. So as a parent, I've actually become aware of trying to make sure my children, sure it's just a toy robot puppy, but don't kick it. Because when you kick it, you're hurting yourself. You're changing the way your brain works. You're changing the way you respond to the appearance of mind and pain and pleasure. And I mean, there's obviously, I think, a lot of empirical research that needs to be done about the degree to which we are affected as moral beings as we shift in how we understand and kind of resist the natural impulse to attribute mind to things. But when my students in philosophy of mind ask me, well, do you think robots are possible? Like if someone put something in front of you that was passing the Turing test and was completely emulating human behavior, what would you do? And I say, I don't know, there's part of me that would default to saying I think we need to treat this as a valuable being of some kind. Because even if we don't know for sure that there's consciousness there, I have concerns about what it says about us for us to start assuming it lacks humanity or lacks moral worth.
I just turn it off.
He just turns it off.
But really, just one quick thought, a really interesting thought that you're given there, and it makes me, even like when there's an art to Googling something, right? And
Yes.
you know, as a computer scientist, a computer scientist is someone that doesn't know anything about computers, that's why we call it a computer scientist. But I'm always asked, hey, fix my computer for me. And I have no idea how to do it, but I know how to Google, right? And I can instantly find the solution, right? But they can't do it, and I can't figure out why they can't do it. It's almost like the technology is selecting certain kinds of people can do certain things because they think about the world a particular way, maybe more like a computer. And that has real societal impact. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and change how I live in order to access social media the way that other people do.
There's a
I just
fascinating,
think differently.
a fascinating book by Jared Lanier, I believe. It's called You Are Not a Gadget. He was one of the pioneers back in the 70s of some of this stuff. And he says that just the way stuff was set up initially, the decisions that were made have channeled us in what we're doing. I did want to point out that both AIs evolve and we evolve, and we influence each other, right? So it could be this positive spiral rather than, oh, Skynet is going to evolve and destroy us. But then again, the other option is we could have a self-replicating factory, for example, whose one goal is to make paper clips, right? And by the end, the end of 3,000 years, all of the mass in the solar system has been turned into a paperclip. I mean, it's not because they hate us. It's just because that's what their desire is.
It's just mechanistic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Wade. Was there another question in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just have to, all right. And this will be the last question, and then we'll break.
So my name is Jesse Boyce. I'm a political science major here at BYU. And my question, basically to summarize Kant, is an action is only really good if the action itself is good and if the driving force behind that action is also acceptable. So basically, the only way for an action to be good is to do the right thing for the right reasons. And so I'm wondering exactly how would that apply to an AI, because as it currently stands, AI can only really be programmed to do what it's programmed to do. So any kind of moral or ethical programs that are that it has are there because it's been put in there, not necessarily because it wants to do those things, but that's just because of what it has to do.
I guess the point that at least the science fiction writers make is that we might know what we're doing right now over the next 2 years, for example, but science fiction is about possible futures, right? And one of the possibilities is that we could have a situation where self-programming or self-influencing computers begin to evolve. And then if they do, then there's like 3 possible outcomes. The world is completely destroyed, and in fact, in one of the novels,
into a paperclip.
yeah, it turned into, one of the novels, in Mundos en el Abismo, they send out these, they're called von Neumann machines, which are self-replicating machines to prepare the way for human colonists. They basically go out and depopulate the entire Milky Way over the course of a few million years. So there's no life, period. So that's one. The other one is that we all enter into some sort of a Zion-like state, because we're all, we're healthy. We have these other beings, that may or may not have souls, but they're still sentient. That's kind of what. And then the third way is that we win the battle and become like Dune in the book Dune, the series Dune. There aren't any computers. They develop human calculators because the computers tried to take over. Artificial intelligence have tried to take over the universe of Dune.
So I'll just say that Kant's meta-ethics don't work, but I am a human, full disclosure. But if the question is about how something that we understand as programmed to fill some end could ever come to be motivated for the right reasons as opposed to for its programming, I think, talk to a Kantian scholar, I think that you have to have some first principles in reasoning. And that appears to me to include for Kant a valuing of agency and other agents. So in a sense, that's a program, right? In a sense, even the Kantian moral agent starts with a certain programming in the form of some basic moral principles, and it's on reflection upon those that we appropriately make moral judgments. So maybe computers, maybe robots could be Kantians, heaven forbid. I'm saying.
I guess for me, if I could sneak a word in from a political science perspective, it would be that a lot of the ethical questions are about the people and organizations that choose to make these decisions about how to deploy AI. And there, I think, obviously, there are a lot of important ethical questions, but also practical ones. I mean, CEOs today have to decide whether to deploy the kinds of artificial intelligence that they have at their technological capacity, even when they know that it will create more unemployment, for example. So, speaking of people without souls but who are sentient.
Yes.
And so one of the issues that's facing American and European politicians is how much of this stuff do we let loose? Now, it has to be said that if we invented a robot today that would take all of our jobs away, and all the jobs that you're going to get, you could still get a new job tomorrow if we can sustain aggregate demand. But that is a hard problem to fix politically, because we have these increasingly unequal societies in which has massive effects on how demand is shaped. So to put it the most simple way, if I'm Jeff Bezos and I have more money than God, as they say, then I'm not going to be buying a whole lot of stuff, right, compared to what I own. What I own is so massive, I don't spend that much of it. And so as countries become more unequal, sustaining aggregate demand becomes more difficult, a harder and harder political problem to manage. And that's why we're in this funny situation today where there are actually lots of AI applications that could be out there at work. But there is a sense of unease in the land. And that's particularly true with populist politicians in Europe who are very angry about the economic effects of where we've been in the last decade. And I've heard rumors of populist politicians in the United States who might have similar concerns. So these things are very, very tricky. And it's quite a lot of fun to have three people who know so much about them talking about this tonight. And thank you, each of you, to Dale and Jake and Katie for your expertise on this. Thanks again to Heather for organizing this session, and to all of you for your questions. And am I right, Heather, in saying that that snacks await those who have been patient?
Yes. Danish pastries.
Danish pastries. Okay, and human made?
Human made. I resisted the temptation to get dehydrated ice cream for you, right?
Okay.
So, it's space food.
Thank you, everybody.